Good evening, everyone. This is Robin Dillard. I'm publisher of BEQ Pride Magazine, and we're going live tonight to talk to our good friend, Kevin Spencer Beckwith, and it's all about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Tonight, we want to take a step back and take a look at each one of those words and understand how to take it back to basics. And I thought having Kevin on tonight would be ideal and fascinating because he has such a wealth of experience. He's so committed. As a matter of fact, I'm going to read from my notes here. Kevin is a turnaround specialist, an anti-racism strategist, and a servant leader and speaker. He is currently Chief People Officer at GRYT Health. And Kevin, welcome. And please tell our audience a little bit about your background and who you are and what you do.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. So I'll give you a little bit of I'm originally from Kingston, Jamaica. My whole family actually is from either the north coast of Jamaica or Kingston, the capital. I was born there, and about 3 months ended up moving to the Bahamas Islands. So, for people that don't know it, generally Jamaica is one big island. The Bahamas is multiple islands. So traditionally here, Nassau, Freeport, Grand Bahama, Andros, Eleuthera, and so on. I actually spent about 14 years in Nassau, the capital of the Bahamas, which is a pretty tiny island, about 7 miles by 21. And then I spent about 4 years in Freeport, Grand Bahama, which is about 48, 50 miles long, about 28 miles wide, so kind of long and very narrow. And so I moved to the United States at about 18. A family here in upstate New York sponsored me and came here for college and for work and to really, if we stayed in the islands, we'd have to really stay in the hospitality field, which is the dominant sort of job stream. And my dad wanted something different for us. He was an engineer by trade, and he just felt that hospitality would limit us to only certain jobs or limit us to staying on the island. And so I came up here for school, and yeah, I would say pretty early on in my career, I discovered that I believed that servant leadership was missing in the corporate world. And so that's the leadership style I practice. And for those who are not familiar with that, command and control is sort of on one side, empowerment style leadership is kind of on the other side, and somewhere in the middle is a kind of a mix of both. Command and control you typically see practice quite a bit in the military space.
Military. Yes.
So usually it's sort of, tell you what to do, when to do it, how to do it. Don't ask, just do it. And because, when you're in theater and, someone's making a decision, there's not a lot of room to compromise or to negotiate. It's, because it can mean a difference between life or death. But in the business world, servant leadership is a wonderful style of leadership that is much more dominant today. Years ago, when I started practicing it 20 some years ago, we couldn't even call it servant leadership. We just kind of practiced it because if you said it, people said that was soft leadership. It wasn't, effective and so on. And so I was kind of practicing servant leadership in the closet, so to speak. So I was using all the tenets of it, but never put it on my resume, never talked about it. And I have to say right now, I'm proud to say that it's, prominently on my LinkedIn profile. It's within my resume. And it comes up in my interviews when I'm looking at different opportunities. And then when I talk to groups about effective leadership, the underpinnings of it is servant leadership. Leaders are at its core here to serve, not to be served.
Right.
And so it really positions, and probably to give you a good visual, I take a look at my org chart. Typically, when I'm in an organization, I manage up to 600 people. And so one of my assignments I turn it upside down. So what it shows you is that the most senior leader is really the biggest servant. And it really illustrates the importance of how we're supposed to listen to, understand, and meet the needs of our folks.
Right. Wow. Wow. That is definitely an amazing way to approach this work. It's so important. And so tell us a little bit about GRYT Health in your role there. You haven't been there that long, right? That you've made
Yeah,
some moves.
fairly new actually. In fact, it's kind of neat because we've been recruiting. In fact, I literally came on board and was having to post within a week because we went from we're a small startup company, started about 6 years ago. Started with a dream. Our CEO David Craig is a two-time cancer survivor, and when he went through that whole experience, what he's noticed was missing was it wasn't human centered. You know, the treatment was really very functional, very practical. There was really no one to kind of help guide him through what's it like to go
Mm-hmm.
through the treatment. What are the effects? Quality of life. Your life changes. He had testicular cancer, so
Mm-hmm.
one of his surgeries completely changed what he said that he grew up thinking of what a man included certain things. And he said,
Mm-hmm.
only to find out that, oh my goodness, all of those things that I used to think of as being a man is now gone.
Gone,
And
right?
so there was no one to help prepare him for it, no one to talk to him about it, no one to, counsel him or to say, hey, here's what I've done. So it was just, it was a very isolating experience. And so he essentially wanted to create a company that at its core created community. So in other words, when you're diagnosed with cancer, to be able to, you log in, set up, you immediately get connected to a
Mm-hmm.
global community. And so we have monthly meetups. That people essentially just you register, you join it, and you get a chance to listen to, talk, and just visit and commune with other people globally that are struggling with cancer in one way, shape, or form. And at a minimum, it's kind of like a support group. At a maximum, it's about getting real good information that could eventually lead to understanding new clinical trials, participating in research, getting information that will empower you to be able to be in the driver's seat of your care. And so that's kind of the free part of our business that we essentially
Mm-hmm.
why we got started. But in order to pay for that, we actually have two payment streams of our business, where one is working in with research companies, helping them to perform human-centered research. We
Mm-hmm.
also put on we call it empowerment virtual conferences. Our largest one we just had recently in November is called the Global Virtual Cancer Conference. It's
Mm-hmm.
a really is a signature program that we have at over 50 some countries that are represented, and almost 3,000 people that join that conference over a few days, and that's just one of our conferences. And so, one of the things, and we're really just scratching the surface, because if you think about it, the number of people that are diagnosed with cancer every year
Yeah.
is a significant number. And so this community really helps to support people who are not just diagnosed today, that are in remission, coming out of
Right.
remission. Folks that are
Right.
just, your life has changed because you're living with a compromised immune system because of what the chemo did to damage your system. And so there's really an ongoing level of support, and we're really trying to create a community that creates a sense of connectedness. And what we're looking to do, it's a very ambitious mission, but it's one we believe is doable. And we want to put the human back into the center of all that whole ecosystem of healthcare, starting first with prevention to make sure people don't get sick in the first place. So we can really, education, awareness, those sorts of things. But if you do get if you are sick, we want to be able to get you detected fairly quickly, because the earlier you detect cancer or any other diagnosis, the greater chance that the remedy will be successful. And then the next step is therapy. So we want to make sure there's equity in the detection. So no matter
Yeah.
what zip code you're in, no matter who you are, no matter where you are, no matter your economic status, we want to know that you have the ability to be detected quickly so that then treatment can start. And then, oh, by the way, we want that treatment, the best of the best, to be available to everyone. And then ultimately, we want to make sure that there's equity in outcomes. So therefore,
Yeah.
today, for example, most people are not aware, unless you're in the cancer space, that African American women that are diagnosed with breast cancer die at twice the rate of white women, twice the rate. And part of what that outcome is because of inequities earlier in the stream,
Mm-hmm.
downstream, as I just mentioned, detected later, not necessarily getting the best therapies, not necessarily being able to really have sometimes economics to be able to support what's needed to get to the right therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore the outcomes are very different. And so our goal is to raise awareness through our virtual conferences, getting the right stakeholders to the table who have the resources to be able to help eliminate and change some of those inequities. And that's essentially the core part of our business.
Okay, so I was hearing quite a bit, especially on the support side, and just the entire continuum of services, and the prevention part of it. What I'm wondering is, are there support services for caregivers and the family members of cancer
Absolutely.
patients? And okay.
Absolutely. It's a wonderful question, by the way. So when I talk of community, community is all of that. So it's the family members, it's the caregivers, it's the providers, and then the patients themselves. And so what we've discovered is that, particularly on a personal level, what really, one of the things that sort of really attracted me to this company is that I myself, had a connection with cancer. My brother and his wife, he was 52, she was 50, were diagnosed about 9 months apart, and with stage 4 by the time it was detected. And so we lost both of them within, less than 2 years. My brother after 11 months from his diagnosis and 18 months from my sister-in-law. Pretty young. They had 2 kids at home, and quite honestly, it was such a whirlwind. And I just remember, just at times wondering if I was in a movie, or I was in a dream, and that someday I would just wake up and this was just not happening. And so when I think about that whole experience for me personally, even though my brother and my sister-in-law were the ones that were diagnosed and going through therapy, or her entire family were walking with them on this journey, not knowing what to say, what to do, sometimes just feeling powerless, feeling isolated, just you name it. Yeah. And so, so when someone is going through a diagnosis, particularly cancer, but it can be other things.
Mm-hmm.
They take the family with them. And so
Yes.
when we talk of community, we talk about the broadest definition of community. So when we have our meetup sessions, we have people that show up that are the patients, the family members, friends, and in some cases, just the friend or the caregiver, not even the patient, right? So
Okay.
in other words, it's a community that really is there to help people to process and to manage the challenges that go along with a diagnosis that could be life-threatening.
Wow. Yeah. And what's really interesting that you brought up in introducing uh, the topic and specifically giving us some background on the grit health. Um, what I'm thinking about is the topic today is about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And when you spoke about cancer as a diagnosis, it doesn't discriminate. However, sometimes there are conditions and situations that predispose certain groups of people more so than others, or the outcomes are different. So
Yes.
let's talk about that. Let's talk about how you see Jedi. I'm calling it Jedi. BEQ is calling it Jedi. With respect to the kind of work you do and how you see it for your organization, the importance of having that servant leadership mindset that you come to the table with, but with these principles in justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and why they matter.
I tell you, that's you hit on, I think I would say, the magic number in terms of the things that really are keep us up at night, right? Which is, and I'll go back to what you said earlier, cancer or any other health diagnosis doesn't discriminate, right? Because simply because we're all human. So our bodies are susceptible to any kind of illness, virus, you name it. The pandemic recently just really
Mm-hmm.
made that even more crystal clear for us. In fact, what the pandemic did is to really expose inequities that we've been living with, and in some cases, as a society, ignoring for quite some
Mm-hmm.
time. But what the pandemic showed was that ignoring those inequities actually is not good for everyone. Kind of, in fact, it made me think of Martin Luther King: "Injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere." And
Right.
at the end of the day, essentially, what the pandemic showed was that whole segments of our community that have been living with inequities, systemic poverty, underfunded resources, underfunded schools, no health care or limited access to health care, low paying or poverty wages, no benefits, all those things that we as a society have been ignoring for the most part, mainly because we have not addressed them. I say we're ignoring them. Turns out that during the pandemic, those very people were the critical workers. They were the folks that helped to do all the things that we needed to keep alive, to stay alive, to be well, to keep the economy going. And those were the very people that we've been ignoring. And so what was really interesting was that some of the policies that we rolled out in short order, something we couldn't do in any other political year, we got them done because we were trying to survive as a
Mm-hmm.
human community. And my hope is that that stays fresh in our minds, Now that the pandemic is starting to get to a different stage, to recognize that the work we did in short order during the pandemic, we should make it systemically an ongoing solution to eliminate inequities. And so bring that right full circle to healthcare. When you think about how cancer, anybody can be diagnosed with cancer. However, if you look at the inequities at the front end for, prevention,
Mm-hmm.
in order to be able to even know if you have the early stages of cancer, you need to be able to have your checks, your access to a doctor. You need to be able to have the ability to pay for that doctor, or if you don't have health care or have a doctor in close proximity to where you live, you need to be able to have time off to be able to get to, all those things that we take for granted for people that are in, middle or upper middle class or middle class, don't realize that people on the lower end of the economic scale have jobs that have limited access to benefits or no benefits, limited time off, because they're stitching together multiple jobs to try to get to a livable wage. So they have less time to take care of themselves, less time to even notice that they're not feeling well.
Yeah.
And so all those things, those inequities baked into the early part of the process eventually leads to later detection, later diagnosis. And so by the time they find a cancer, it is at a stage 4, stage
Mm-hmm.
3, which means your outcome is going to be grossly different.
So let me add something to this, because now we've touched so many issue areas, if you will, but even something as simple as food insecurity, right? Or that plays a role. The kinds and qualities of food that people are eating and how that impacts their health. I mean, that's even before you're even sick or even have a doctor. It's just how
Right,
you're being fed,
right.
your education, to even know things. So I think this is really powerful. And one of the things I wanted to bring up, since BEQ Pride magazine is focused first on the LGBTQ plus and same gender loving community, and then everyone else, any allies and people that love the community, welcome to this robust discussion. But there happens to be a situation where people in the LGBTQ plus community end up diagnosed with cancer a little more often, and oftentimes find difficulty finding caregivers that they feel comfortable with. So, I want to just throw that into the conversation and think about your role as chief people officer. And, it's more or less you have a very young company, but the idea is to be inclusive of all communities and people that, find themselves with a diagnosis of cancer, or a family member, a loved one that they have to care for. And then when these families and the community are differently abled or LGBTQ plus, and how are we bringing this together, and how are we meeting the needs of the diverse community?
So I tell you, that's a really good point, because one of the things that when we talk about equity, particularly in the areas of that whole value stream I talked about, and one of them that really, and we'll touch on a little bit later, is clinical trials, right?
Mm-hmm.
And making
Oh,
sure
yeah.
those clinical trials are representative,
Mm-hmm.
and access to it, even knowledge of it, those sorts of things. So when we talk about equity, we really are talking, have to really maybe touch on what does diversity mean, right? And so diversity, in its early stages, was really focused on the demographics. Are you in the room? Are you in the company? Are you in this position? Are you in, and sometimes it was just, are you in the company? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And then as it evolved to realize that in some cases people were in the company, but only one room, one side, one area of the company. Right.
Right.
And so then, inclusion and equity started to show up to say, well, all right, if you're in the room, you want to make sure you can go to any room and you can be in any position, that you can, be in any role. And so some of that started to happen, and then the next question was then, well, wait a minute, we have demographics, we have a little bit of improvement of folks in the different positions, but we're not seeing any systemic change. And it's because you may be in the room sitting in a seat, but if you don't have the right level of inclusivity and welcoming and support to voice your opinion, to bring your unique perspective to the table, for it to be valued and validated, in fact, to be able to drive change, then what you have is DE and I that's out of balance. So you got, think of it as a three-legged stool where they're all at different levels. And if you look at it, humanity is kind of, not really in any sort of level platform, because the company doesn't have a true welcoming culture that is based in equity. And
Mhm.
so, if you really want to build a company that has true diversity, equity, inclusion, you need to have in the structure, the scaffolding of that company, true equity in all of its forms. Martin Luther King talked about this back in the 60s, when he really, after the I Have a Dream speech, after voting rights bill, after the civil rights bill, he started to realize that we may have passed a bill to really allow for access to the voting booth, to allow for the ability to go and sit in a restaurant. But what we didn't do was the issue of true equity. So
Mhm.
really recognizing all human beings to be fully and completely equal, that there's no other, there's no thingification, there's no marginalization. And so when you start to see those things show up, even if it's not you at the other end of that other or marginalization, and some people take comfort in that and go, hey, I don't have anything, I'm not doing that, so I don't need to do anything. Not
Mhm.
realizing someday it may visit your doorstep, right?
That's
So
right.
all it takes is something to happen in society. And all of a sudden, because we've been able to allow for this notion that any one particular part of the human race can thingify or otherize or marginalize another part of the human race,
Mhm.
it sets the wheels in motion, and someday that could shift towards you. And so, therefore, it's so important when you think about healthcare that we have to really have it to be human centered at its core. It should be the epicenter of how we plan out, how we rolling out communication for prevention, education, food. So, for example, you take this is something that's a really hot button for me. Where I live here in Rochester, in Rochester, New York, upstate New York, our city is known for Eastern Kodak. It's
Mhm.
where the company got started. Are known for Finger Lakes. We've known for a lot of positives. But if you Google us today, we're also known as being the number one city for children living in poverty under 20. And the reason for that is because for years we've ignored something we did years ago that no one's ever made a decision to change the course of that. And it's happened in many cities, but in our city in particular, was redlining. What redlining did is it created essentially a level of segregation that once it got started, the wheels in motion were set and was never corrected. So therefore, today, in 2022, our schools are more segregated today than they were in 1950. Think about that for a second. More segregated today than they were in the 50s. And the reason being is because what we did back then to segregate the suburbs, we used a number of instruments that, whether it be FHA loans, deed and covenant restrictions, exclusionary zoning laws, all those things. So if you notice, those names don't say white only. Those names don't say no blacks allowed or no color. They don't doesn't say any of those sort of buzzwords you would associate with segregation, because they're instruments that are a little bit more blunt and they're less discriminatory. So what they do is they may keep out the intended audience, but also creates collateral damage and causes other things, right?
Mhm.
And so therefore, today when we think of healthcare and food security, it's I struggle with the fact that we have great supermarkets in the
Mhm.
suburbs where I live and all of the different suburbs. But as soon as you go, in my case, 10 minutes northeast from where I live, um, there's no, those supermarkets are gone. They're all closed down. So therefore, the only things that people are getting food from the Family Dollar store or the Dollar Tree or Dollar, a lot of these franchises that used to have other things now are actually selling food. And it's not fresh food in terms of, fresh vegetables and fruits and so on. So therefore, not only we did not correct the problem we did years ago,
Mhm.
now we've compounded that by
Yeah,
pulling away resources.
exacerbated. Mhm.
Exactly. So to me, when I think about healthcare, it's just part of a broader question of where if a company today, so if a CEO is watching this program right now and is disturbed by what you just heard, I would ask you to go and look in the mirror and ask yourself, what part of this problem do you own? Where's your cup of this problem? So if, for example, if I own a string of grocery stores, I would say to myself, if I'm doing well with my grocery stores in the suburbs, why did I move out of the city? And you may have reasons. Maybe not enough volume. You couldn't charge as much as you do in the suburbs. And so therefore the financials look different. But wouldn't it be interesting if as an anti-racist action, you may put together a plan that says, I am going to put strategically a smaller version of those stores to get your costs down, but at its core, the same quality foods that are available in the suburbs available to the people in the inner city. And in fact, hire all the people that live in the city. And in fact, pay a livable wage. Let's go
Well,
further. Benefits.
right.
Let's go further. Let's subsidize that with the people that are in the suburbs. Subsidize, take some of the funds from there to make sure that you can pay a livable wage. You can make sure that you're employing people, providing them with fresh food, all of this good stuff. You could do that as an anti-racist action. Say, I want to help address the prevention part of healthcare by providing good quality food that can, reduce the chances of certain diagnoses. Same thing with healthcare. You have large, University of Rochester, Rochester Regional, for us here, and we have certainly large units, and we have a lot of primary care sites that are all over the area. The question is, uh, we have smaller organizations like Trillium Health, Jordan Health Clinic, that are serving the inner city, which would really benefit from more partnership from some of the larger systems that are operating with $4 billion or $16 billion, you name it. And so to me, that would be an anti-racist action to help bring about equity. Those are the type of things that I think we're at a more basic question now around DE&I. It's no longer programs. It's no longer fancy PowerPoint slides or bringing in expensive speakers who has
Mhm.
a book deal that you're going to buy their book and get a signature. I would say that performative part of DE&I really needs to go by the wayside and to really
Mhm.
get back to the basics of humanity.
I love the way you brought that full circle because that's the point. And we're not really trying to compel people to take these human-centered actions, but there is an economic value to this. Can you tell us a little bit about why it's important to take this step as an anti-racist, to be a servant leader, all those things that you shared about your work, but just why is that of value to me? If I am a cis, white, straight man, why is it important to me? Why do I have a stake in this game? Because all does mean all.
You got it. So I'm going to give you two answers. I would say the most simplest one is because we're all human and we are all deserving of equity. That's the simplest answer. To give a more complicated answer for people that may or not are not motivated by what I just said. So, for example, I know folks that they look at the bottom line. They don't really care about humanity in that sense. They have a sense of humanity, but for their immediate family. They don't have what's called a broader definition of, to me, my family is everybody I meet. You know
Mhm.
why? Because we all need each other. And I don't see any value in me doing well and somebody else not doing well. I don't enjoy my wellness if somebody else doesn't have wellness.
Mhm.
However, I'm also a realist. There's some people that are pretty centered, and so they're concerned about what's in it for me. So
Mhm.
I'll offer that there's a business case for what we're talking about.
Mhm.
It's not just altruistic, and so it's very simple. I'll pick on Walmart as a good example.
Okay.
Walmart is a company because there's a lot of studies around this. So this is stuff that you can Google and take a look at for the folks that are listening. Walmart is one of the largest private employers in the United States. Now they've started to do some of this now, so it's starting to come to fruition. But they could have done this years ago. When you look at the profit margins of Walmart, they
Mhm.
clearly are making billions and billions of dollars.
Yes.
Much of that money was going to a small handful of people, their senior executives, maybe their mid managers, and so on.
Mhm.
But the vast majority of their employees, when they would get hired on, in addition to being hired on, they would also get a pamphlet on how to sign up for social services.
Mhm.
So therefore, their business case, they were aware that they were paying poverty wages to the
Mhm.
extent that they knew that their employees, that they were hiring to create the billions of dollars in profit would actually be entitled to social benefits. Now, let me put my anti-racist hat on for a second, and at the same time be responsible to my shareholders and the community that we live and work in. If I were to pay all of my workers a livable wage, so which means you shift that income from being top heavy to really being bottom right, I call it, right? So instead of top heavy, bottom right. So you basically pay people the right amount of money to give them a livable wage. The goal is really simple. I want to pay you enough that you only need one job. If you want to go get a second job, that's cool, but not because I'm underpaying you. I'm going to make sure that these billions of dollars that I'm making, before I start divvying them up into my shareholders and in my dividends or the pockets of my senior leaders, I'm going to make sure that I pay them right. What do you think is going to happen? Most of those workers are already working for the store. They're going to shop it. So some of those dollars will actually come right back into the cash register. But oh, by the way, what's beneficial is less sick days because people will now have one job, not two. Full benefits so that they can go and see the doctor well in advance of something becoming a problem. Time off to be able to enjoy and spend time with their family. Time to be able to go home and spend time with their kids so that their kids could get a quality, not just education, but time with their parents to be able to help them with their homework and so on. So they're able to, do something maybe different than if their parents are not there because they're working 3 or 4 jobs. Better quality of life, less stress. And my goodness, wouldn't it be wonderful to know you have a company that has good prices, but you were able to take your profits and put them where they should be, which is with your core resource, your people. That is not just altruistic. It makes good business sense because then it's easier to manage because you'd have a cashier that stays with you for 30 years. You'd have employees that you're not constantly hiring, you're not constantly messing with schedules. You're really not dealing with employee issues because of the stress associated with working multiple jobs. You have better customer satisfaction. Why? Because then they can focus on your customer and not on your light bill. So there's so many benefits to this that I remember practicing this on a very small scale in one of my roles where when I took over this group, I discovered out of my 5 departments, one, they were being paid poverty wages. As soon as I found it out, I put together a plan to put them at a livable wage and to have it happen over a period of about 2 years. When I got to that end point where they were now being paid a livable wage, and how I paid for it was really simple, what I described earlier. I took the raises that would normally go to the folks that were making more money, and I made those less. And then I used that money, which would have more impact to the people on the low end of the pay raise. So they still got a pay raise, but not as much as they would have got normally. And then I let them know transparently what I was doing because I said it's not acceptable to me that we have some of you that can go home at the end of the day and some that cannot. We can't claim to be a good work family and allow that to happen. Nobody objected. So here's what happened. All of those people in that department all quit their second job. 30% ended up going back to use the educational benefit that they've always had that they never could take advantage of.
No time.
Because they had no time. Satisfaction went up from, was it 70% to 89% in one year. We also had lower turnover. And guess what was interesting? My productivity and efficiency went up. It was the highest across the business because people were able to focus more and they felt more vested. They could recognize we saw value in them, so they then saw value in us. And so there was this huge, I remember, them sending a performance team down to my site. They planned to spend a whole week. They left in just a couple of days. I said, there's no magic involved. What I'm doing is I listen to and I'm serving the needs of the employees. And one of those needs is pretty basic. We need to value all of our employees. And the best way to value is to make sure you pay them a livable wage and treat them with the respect and equity that they deserve.
I mean, I could talk with you about this forever and for a very long time. And I'm intending for us to continue this conversation we're going to record it and play it and provide it on LinkedIn and YouTube and on Facebook subsequently. So I'm looking at our schedule shows. We're going to be able to do that next Tuesday, February 4th. And then again on February 6th, the second half of this conversation. But I'm so grateful to have you here today to talk about the basics of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we're all doing this so people feel they belong and they can fully show up and contribute. Because as it stands now, we've got so many people on the sidelines, not because they want to be there, it's because we haven't taken the time to put the humanity back into what we're doing in our enterprises and our capitalism and what we're doing. And it's just good to know there are people like you out there serving in the way that you are. So I'm really grateful to have had a chance to introduce you to our audience at BEQ Pride. And I'm looking forward to us following up on the oncology conversation with the LGBTQ plus community. We're going to have some other people to join in that conversation. And there's some other things happening that we'll keep our audience abreast of. So thank you for coming today, Kevin. And I'm going to say good night.
Thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity.